It was the winter of 1942, when the air itself seemed to carry the weight of despair. Across the English coast, the sky was filled with the low, constant hum of engines returning from missions that had gone wrong. Some never returned at all. The ground crews would stand in silence, eyes searching the horizon long after the night had ended, long after hope had frozen into resignation. In a quiet hangar on the outskirts of Dorset, a single light burned through the fog. Inside, the smell of oil and ozone clung to the air. Wires hung from the ceiling like veins, connecting machines that hummed softly, alive with a cold intelligence, and at the center of it all stood a man thin, quiet, and sleepless. His name was Arthur Hales, an engineer for the Royal Air Force's Radar Research Division. He wasn't a soldier. He didn't wear medals, didn't carry a gun, but he carried something else, the unbearable knowledge that British bombers were being torn from the sky every night. He could hear the casualty lists on the radio, the polite voice announcing death with bureaucratic calm. Each name was a failure, his failure. On the table before him lay a radar display, its green pulse sweeping rhythmically in the dark. Every turn of the line marked another second passing, another reminder of the unseen war, the war of waves and echoes. Arthur leaned closer, his face pale in the glow. Dots flickered and vanished across the screen, each one a reflection of something real, something deadly. He whispered to himself, almost in disbelief. How do you hide a plane from the air itself? It was an impossible question. The German Freya and Würzburg radar systems were terrifyingly precise. They could detect a bomber from miles away, long before the first engine note reached human ears. Every Allied raid was met with a storm of flak. The sky turned into a burning maze of steel and fire. The scientists at the Air Ministry had tried everything: new materials, strange coatings, even wild theories about invisible frequencies. None of it worked. The laws of physics seemed unyielding, the enemy's technology always one step ahead. Arthur ran his hand across the cold metal casing of the radar console. He could feel the faint vibration of the current running through it, like a heartbeat. The machine was alive in its own way, loyal only to the truth of reflection. It could not lie. It could only reveal. Outside, rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, drumming against the corrugated roof. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed a familiar warning, almost routine by now. Arthur didn't move. The world outside could burn, and he would still be here, staring at the endless sweep of light, searching for an answer that refused to come. He thought about the pilots, the young ones who joked on the ground, then vanished into the night sky like ghosts. He remembered their laughter, the way they'd say, "You'll find us a way out of this, won't you, Arthur?" He had promised he would, but the truth was, he didn't know how. Weeks had passed without sleep, his notes scrawled across dozens of sheets, equations, signal maps, sketches of impossible devices. Each one ended the same way: failure. Every idea crumbled under the weight of reality. Still, something inside him refused to stop, a quiet defiance, because in his mind there was always the possibility that nature itself held a loophole, that somewhere in the chaos of waves and frequencies there was a trick, a blind spot waiting to be found. He turned off the radar set, and the hum faded into silence. The darkness in the hangar felt heavier now, pressing in. Only the rain kept speaking. Arthur picked up a small object from his desk, a matchbox, old and half empty. He rolled it between his fingers absent-mindedly, the cardboard soft and worn. He didn't know why he'd kept it there, maybe as a distraction, something human among the machines. He struck a match and watched the flame flicker to life. For a moment, it painted his face in orange light, and in that fragile glow, the reflection in his eyes looked like something else entirely, a spark of something yet unnamed. He whispered under his breath, "There's always a way to fool the light." Then the match went out, and the darkness returned. In the quiet that followed, the sound of the rain became steady again, like the ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. Arthur leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, and somewhere deep in the labyrinth of his thoughts, an idea began to stir, not yet formed, not yet conscious, but alive. He didn't know it then, but that small flicker, that silent obsession to outsmart the unseen, would soon change the course of the war. The impossible problem. Morning arrived slowly over the Dorset airfield. The fog had not lifted. It never truly did. It rolled in from the channel and settled low, clinging to the hangars and the silent aircraft parked in neat, solemn rows. The ground crew moved like shadows through it, their boots muffled on the damp concrete, their breaths visible in the cold. Inside the research building, Arthur Hales stood before a table cluttered with fragments of metal and glass. The air smelled of coffee gone bitter, of dust and warm circuits. His assistant, a young technician named Reed, entered quietly, holding a stack of printed reports. "Another 10 bombers lost last night," Reed murmured. His voice trembled with exhaustion. "The radar picked them up the moment they crossed the coast. They didn't stand a chance." Arthur didn't look up. He was tracing a finger along the edge of a small copper plate, lost in thought. "They always see us first," he said quietly. "They always see." He turned toward the radar set that dominated the room, a crude but brilliant piece of engineering, all knobs and humming tubes. The screen glowed faintly green in the dim light, a ghostly circle that revealed every movement in the sky, every reflection, every signal. The truth, unkind and absolute. Arthur spoke as though thinking aloud. "If they can see us, we can make them see more than there is. The trick isn't to disappear, it's to make them doubt what they're seeing." Reed frowned. "Sir, we've tried interference. The jammers burn out the circuits before they do anything useful." Arthur nodded absently. "Not interference, confusion." He paused, eyes fixed on the slow, rhythmic sweep of the radar. The sound, that steady, hypnotic pulse, seemed to echo through his mind like a heartbeat. The sound of a system that never slept. He turned away and walked to the window. Outside, the airfield stretched into mist. Men moved about the planes, their figures half swallowed by the fog. Somewhere, an engine coughed to life. Arthur's reflection on the glass looked pale and hollow, the reflection of a man more ghost than flesh. He remembered the first time he'd seen radar work, the magic of it, the invisible made visible. Now, that same brilliance was their undoing. He couldn't escape the irony. The very science that promised safety had become the eye of the enemy. He pressed his hand against the cold window pane and whispered, "If only we could make them see ghosts." The phrase lingered in the air. Reed didn't respond, but he looked up suddenly, sensing that something had shifted in Arthur's tone, something fragile, yet dangerous. Arthur walked back to his desk. The matchbox from the night before still sat there. He picked it up again, turning it over in his hand. The lid caught the morning light and flashed briefly a sharp glint that drew his eye. A reflection. He frowned and tilted it again, watching how the metal strip on its edge caught and threw light at different angles. To anyone else, it was nothing. But to a man obsessed with signals and echoes, it was everything. A reflection could lie. Arthur's mind began to race. He reached for a small radio set on the bench, tuning it to a test frequency. Static filled the air, a wash of noise like ocean surf. Then he picked up a piece of aluminum foil, crumpled it slightly, and held it near the receiver. The signal wavered faintly, but noticeably. He froze. "Reed," he called quietly. "Look at this." Reed stepped closer as Arthur moved the foil back and forth, watching the interference pattern change. The radar echo, small, fleeting, appeared and vanished on the screen. "That's a reflection," Reed said, confused. "It's just noise." Arthur smiled faintly. "No, it's a ghost, a false echo." He stared at the screen, the small flickering dot that wasn't real but appeared as if it were. For the first time in months, he felt something stir inside him, not certainty, but the beginning of it. He thought of the endless green dots across enemy radar screens, each representing death, precision, and control. What if those dots could multiply, blur, become meaningless? What if the enemy couldn't tell which was real and which was a trick? Arthur placed the foil on the table and sat back, his mind spinning faster than the radar's sweep. The idea wasn't ready yet. It was raw, fragile, barely coherent, but it was there. Outside, the rain had stopped. The fog thinned just enough for a shaft of pale sunlight to fall through the window, striking the matchbox once again. Its surface glimmered, like a quiet signal in the distance. Arthur looked at it and whispered, "There's always a way to fool the light. And maybe the air too. The hum of the machines filled the silence that followed. The room felt suddenly alive, as if it knew something had changed. He took a breath, long and steady, and opened his notebook. The first line he wrote was simple, almost childlike: create false echoes. It was barely a thought, yet it felt monumental, the first spark of an idea that could alter the tide of war. Arthur didn't notice how long he sat there afterward, staring at those words, listening to the faint pulse of the radar. To him, it no longer sounded like a heartbeat. It sounded like a countdown. The pressure builds, January 1943. The nights were longer now, the kind that swallowed entire airfields in silence before the engines began to roar. Snow gathered at the edges of the runway, melting under the exhaust of idling bombers. Every takeoff carried the same unspoken weight, a question that none of them dared to voice aloud. Would they come back? Arthur Hales stood in the control tower, his hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee gone cold. Below him, crews moved like ants under yellow lamps, loading bombs, adjusting instruments, checking the wings for ice. He watched as another Lancaster taxied into position, its four engines rumbling low like distant thunder. He should have felt pride. Instead, he felt a quiet dread. He knew that somewhere across the channel, in the blackness over occupied France, the German radar operators were waiting, eyes glued to their glowing screens, tracking every one of these aircraft before they even reached the coast. The radar never slept. It saw everything. Behind him, the door creaked open. Commander Wilkes entered, his coat still wet from the snow. His voice cut through the room like a blade. Another 18 lost last night. Cologne raid. They saw us coming from 40 miles out. 40, Arthur. Arthur didn't answer. He set the mug down gently on the table, watching the steam vanish. Wilkes paced, his anger barely restrained. We can't keep doing this. The Air Ministry wants results. You promised your interference system could blind their radar. And yet, he gestured sharply toward the airfield, those boys are still dying. Arthur turned to face him. His eyes were hollow but steady. Sir, I can't blind them. Not yet. But maybe I can make them see what isn't there. Wilkes frowned, confused and irritated. What does that even mean? Arthur hesitated. The idea, the one born from that matchbox, from that flicker of foil, was still forming, still too fragile to explain. It means, he said quietly, we stop fighting their machines with strength. We fight them with illusion. Wilkes stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. Illusion won't stop flak. Illusion won't bring those crews home. He turned and walked away, leaving the smell of wet wool and tobacco behind him. The door slammed shut. Arthur stayed by the window, eyes unfocused. Outside, one of the bombers lifted into the sky, its engines roaring against the frozen air. For a few seconds, it glowed like a star. Then, it was gone, swallowed by darkness. He whispered to no one. Maybe illusion is all we've got left. The following days blurred into a kind of fever. Arthur barely left the lab. He worked in silence, sleeves rolled up, his fingers raw from soldering and rewiring. The hum of machinery filled the air, the heartbeat of obsession. On the wall, pinned among the clutter, hung dozens of sketches, radar wave diagrams, notes about reflection angles, and crude drawings of thin metal strips labeled test material. He tested everything: tin lids, cigarette foil, strips of copper, even fragments of broken mirrors. Each reflected differently. Each told him something new. Reed watched from across the room, too tired to question anymore. You really think this will work? He asked one night, voice low, as the storm outside rattled the windows. Arthur didn't look up. I don't know, but if it does, we'll make ghosts dance in their sky. The two men stood there in silence, listening to the static on the receiver. It came and went, like breathing, unpredictable, alive. Arthur adjusted the dials, watching faint echoes appear on the screen, random and flickering. He thought of the German operators again, staring at similar screens. If he could make those same flickers appear on theirs. He rubbed his eyes. The fatigue was unbearable now. Days without sleep blurred into one another. The lab had become his world, the smell of solder, the crackle of electricity, the bitter coffee that kept him moving. Outside, the war raged on. Cities burned, pilots vanished, Commanders shouted. But in this small, dimly lit room, the future of deception was taking shape one small reflection at a time. Arthur leaned over his notebook and scribbled the words he couldn't get out of his mind. Make them see what isn't there. He underlined it twice. The snow outside turned to rain by morning, tapping gently against the windows. Reed dozed in his chair, head tilted back, mouth slightly open. Arthur didn't notice. His eyes were fixed on a small patch of foil tacked to the wall. It shimmered faintly in the lamplight, fragile, weightless, ordinary. But in that fragile glimmer, he saw possibility. He whispered to himself, "They'll think they see an army, and they'll never know what's real." The pressure builds. The weeks that followed were a blur of exhaustion and quiet defiance. Arthur barely slept.